The wind was a blade, honed on the desolate plains, finding every gap in the small cabin's chinking, tearing at the rough-spun clothes of Silas Thorne. He stood by the single window, watching the relentless sweep of gray across the frozen landscape, the kind of endless sky that could crush a man's spirit just by its sheer, indifferent scale. His only companion, old John, a rangy hound mix whose coat was thick with age and resilience, whined softly by the door, restless for the hunt. Silas rarely felt restlessness himself. Isolation had long ago leached out the need for company or diversion. There was the work of the traps, the firewood, the mending, and the silence. The silence was a thing he had cultivated, a shield against echoes he preferred not to hear. Today, the wind carried something different, a faint, unnatural scent. Old John's ears pricked, his low whine deepening into a guttural growl. Silas grabbed his rifle, a familiar weight in his hand, and stepped out into the punishing air. Old John, usually content to follow his master's lead, pulled urgently towards the north, his body language screaming alarm. Silas followed, boots crunching on the brittle crust of snow. The dog led him over a rise, past a cluster of wind-scoured pines, and then stopped, rigid, a low, sorrowful sound escaping his throat. Below them, half buried in a drift near a rock outcropping, lay a shape that was undeniably human. A woman. Her clothes, though fine, were torn and inadequate against the biting cold. A cloak, once vibrant, was frozen stiff around her. Her skin was the color of ash, lips blue, eyes closed. She looked like something the land had tried to swallow and then spat back out, incomplete. Silas approached cautiously, rifle ready. This far out, such a sight was less a tragedy and more a dangerous riddle. Who was she? Why here? Alone? There was no sign of a conveyance. No tracks but those the wind had already blurred into meaningless patterns. Old John nudged the woman's still form with his nose, whimpering. Silas knelt, his gaze sharp, assessing. There was a faint mist before her lips, impossibly fragile against the gale. She was alive, barely. A wave of grim determination, cold and hard as the ground beneath him, settled over Silas. He didn't know her, didn't understand how she came to be here, but the wilderness had its own code, unwritten but deeply felt. You didn't leave a living creature to die in the snow. He carefully unfastened the frozen cloak, noting the quality of the fabric, out of place in this world of homespun and hide. A small, leather-bound satchel lay half-hidden beneath her. He didn't touch it yet. His immediate task was survival, hers. Scooping her up, she felt unervingly light, like a bundle of kindling, fragile bone beneath frozen cloth. Old John trotted close, looking back at the ridge as Silas turned towards the cabin, the wind biting harder now, as if resentful that he dared to snatch this life from its grasp. The silence he had cultivated felt brittle, already threatened by the unknown weight in his arms and the questions that the wind seemed to whisper around him. He carried her through the whipping snow, the cabin a distant promise of warmth against the vast, indifferent canvas of the prairie. Back inside the cabin, the air, thick with the scent of pine smoke and old John's damp fur, felt suddenly cramped, populated. Silas laid the woman carefully on his narrow cot, the rough blankets a stark contrast to her frozen finery. He worked quickly, stripping away the frozen layers of clothing, his movements unjijagin and devoid of hesitation, born of necessity, not curiosity. Her skin was ice-cold, waxy. He wrapped her in warm blankets, piled more on top, then stoked the fire in the hearth until it roared, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of her form. Old John lay near the cot, his eyes fixed on the woman, a low, protective rumble in his chest. For hours Silas watched her. He administered sips of warm water with a spoon, praying it wouldn't freeze her insides. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, each breath a fragile assertion against the encroaching cold she had endured. He saw the delicate bone structure of her face beneath the pallor, the dark, matted hair spread across the rough pillow. Her hands, when he rubbed them gently between his own to try and coax circulation back, were small and finely made, unaccustomed to hardship. There were no rings. He noticed a small, bruised mark on her temple, partially hidden by her hair. Not a fall. A blow. The riddle deepened, hardening Silas's resolve. As dawn broke, painting the edge of the window with a pale, indifferent light, her eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, startling blue, cloudy with pain and confusion, fixing on him with a flicker of fear. She tried to speak, a raspy sound escaping her lips, but no words formed. Silas offered water again, holding the spoon patiently to her lips. She managed a small swallow, her eyes still wide on his face. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough with disuse but steady. "In my cabin. Thorne's the name. Silas Thorne." She blinked, a single tear tracking down her temple. Fear remained, but mixed now with a flicker of something else, perhaps disbelief. She managed a whisper, barely audible. "Lost. Was lost." Over the next few days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her fever spiked, and Silas nursed her with cool cloths and bitter herbal teas. He learned her name Ilara. It sounded foreign, delicate, like something not meant for this land. In her delirium, she murmured fragmented phrases, names he didn't recognize, snippets about a train, a journey, hope turning to despair. He found the satchel by the cot where he'd placed it. Hesitantly, driven by the need to understand her plight, he opened it. Inside were few possessions: a worn Bible, a small, embroidered handkerchief, and a packet of letters tied with ribbon. The letters were addressed to a Mr. Jedediah Cole, care of the general store in Redemption, a rough outpost 2 days' ride south. The contents confirmed his suspicion, whispering of a desperate journey, of promises made across miles of prairie, of a future sought in a land of strangers. She was a mail-order bride. One letter, different from the rest, slipped from the packet. It was not addressed to Jedediah Cole, but to Ilara herself from a different hand, written on expensive paper. This letter was short, cold, and damning. Silas read it, and the quiet understanding he had begun to form shattered, replaced by a cold fury that settled deep in his gut. This was not a tale of a lost traveler or a simple abandonment. This was something far more cruel, a deliberate act of malice. What he learned from that letter changed everything. The woman on his cot was not just lost. She was hunted. And the man waiting in Redemption was not her intended salvation, but the architect of her despair. The letter was stark, brutal in its brevity. It spoke not of a future together, but of a broken agreement, a debt unpaid, a consequence delivered with cold finality. It was from Jedediah Cole, addressed to Ilara, found among the letters to him. It arrived too late, likely after she had already begun her journey based on the earlier, hopeful correspondence. Cole wrote that the arrangement was off, that her family's failure to provide a promised sum meant the deal was null and void. Worse, he stated that given the inconvenience and cost he had incurred, he considered her presence a liability. He instructed her, if she somehow received the letter in time, not to come to Redemption. If she had already left, he stated he would make it clear she was not welcome and would ensure she understood the cost of wasting his time. It wasn't just a cancellation. It was a threat, a warning delivered with chilling indifference. And it was signed not only by Jedediah Cole, but beneath his name, scrawled almost like a postscript, was another signature Silas knew. A name that belonged to a man who rode with a brutal, opportunistic gang that occasionally passed through this territory, leaving trouble in their wake. A man named Finn. The implication was sickeningly clear. Cole hadn't just abandoned her. He had likely arranged for her to be intercepted, perhaps robbed, left to perish somewhere isolated like this. The bruised mark on her temple solidified the grim probability. She hadn't just gotten lost. She had been deliberately stranded, left for dead by men who saw her as disposable baggage. A wave of protective fury, unfamiliar and potent, washed over Silas. He looked at the fragile woman on his cot, the remnants of her near-death struggle still etched on her face, and the silence of his cabin no longer felt like solitude, but a fragile sanctuary he was now compelled to defend. When Ilara's fever finally broke, She was weak but lucid. She spoke softly, haltingly, filling in the gaps the letters and her delirium had left. She was from a small town back east, her family facing financial ruin. The arrangement with Cole had seemed a lifeline, a chance at security and a new life, however uncertain. She described the long, arduous train journey, her arrival at a small station south of Redemption, expecting to be met. Instead, she was met by two men who claimed Cole had sent them to escort her. They took her small trunk, claiming it would follow later, and led her not towards Redemption, but north, deeper into the wilderness. When she grew suspicious, one of them struck her. They took her few remaining valuables and simply rode off, leaving her alone, disoriented, miles from anywhere. Fear had driven her stumbling through the snow until she collapsed. The brutal efficiency of it chilled Silas. It wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated. Alara looked at Silas, her blue eyes clear now, filled with a mixture of gratitude and profound sorrow. He just left me to die," she whispered, the truth echoing hollowly in the small space. Silas didn't speak, his gaze hard. He knew who one of the men who met her likely was, based on the second signature on Cole's letter. Finn. And men like Finn didn't act without purpose. Cole likely wanted her gone permanently to avoid any potential repercussions from her or her family, or simply because she was no longer valuable. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It hinted at a connection between a seemingly respectable man like Jedediah Cole and the criminal element that prowled the fringes of civilization. Alara's recovery was slow, painstaking. Silas taught her small tasks, how to mend the fire, how to prepare simple meals from his meager stores. She learned to move quietly, efficiently, adapting with a surprising, quiet strength. The fear in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a growing determination. She rarely spoke of the past, focusing instead on the present, on the sheer fact of being alive. Silas, in turn, remained stoic, his actions speaking louder than words. He replenished the woodpile tirelessly, checked his traps with renewed diligence, his watchful gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. The knowledge of the men who had left her for dead was a heavy weight, a silent promise of potential danger that permeated the cabin's newfound peace. He knew they might return, either to ensure she was dead, or perhaps because Cole had another use for them. One frigid afternoon, as Alara was mending a tear in her salvaged cloak by the fire, Silas returned from checking his trap line earlier than usual, old John padding silently at his heels. His face was grim. "Riders," he said, his voice low. Alara looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. "Two of them. Heading this way." He didn't need to say who he thought it was. The air in the cabin grew taut with unspoken fear. Silas moved to the window, his rifle ready. Alara stood, her hands trembling slightly, but her jaw set. She wouldn't be a helpless victim again. Silas glanced at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes. This wasn't the same lost, dying woman he had found in the snow. Silas knew this land, every dip and rise. He led Alara and old John through a hidden gully behind the cabin, towards a small, sheltered cave he used for storing supplies. It was cold and damp, but defensible. He settled Alara inside with his rifle, a small lantern, and strict instructions to stay hidden, no matter what she heard. "Don't come out till I call," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And don't hesitate to use that if you have to." Her hand trembled as she took the rifle, but she nodded, her blue eyes meeting his with a fierce resolve he hadn't seen before. "Be careful, Silas," she whispered. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and disappeared back into the snow-laden pines. He circled back, taking advantage of the terrain, and positioned himself strategically on the ridge overlooking the cabin. The two riders emerged from the wind-whipped landscape, dark shapes against the white. As they drew closer, Silas's jaw tightened. Finn was one of them, his cruel face unmistakable even at a distance. The other man was a stranger. They rode directly to the cabin, dismounted, and kicked the door open. Silas watched, rifle raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. They spent several minutes inside, searching, their movements rough and careless. He heard shouts, the sound of things being overturned. Then silence. They emerged, frustration evident in their postures. Finn kicked the cabin door shut with a frustrated oath. They stood outside for a moment, scanning the area. Silas held his breath, melting into the sparse cover. He saw Finn point towards the gully leading to the cave. They suspected she might be near. Silas knew he couldn't let them get close to Alara. He took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. This was it. He fired a single shot, aiming high above their heads, the crack echoing sharply in the stillness. The men reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, spinning to face the sound. They saw him on the ridge, a lone figure against the pale sky. "Thorn!" Finn roared, recognizing him. "You hiding her?" Silas didn't reply. He fired again, this time closer, sending up a spray of snow at their feet. It was a gamble. 2 against 1, and they were closer to the cabin, closer to the gully. But he had the element of surprise and the higher ground. They returned fire, bullets whining past him, splintering wood nearby. Silas ducked down, reloading quickly. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever in a firefight. His only chance was to drive them off, make them think it wasn't worth the trouble. He saw them mount their horses, planning a rush towards the ridge or the gully. He had to act. He fired rapidly, emptying his rifle towards them, forcing them to take cover behind their horses. As they reloaded, Silas used the brief window to scramble down the back of the ridge, out of sight. He ran, hard and fast, back towards the cave. He burst inside, breathless. Alara was huddled in the back, rifle ready, old John a silent sentinel beside her. "Silas!" she cried, relief flooding her face. "They know you're here," he gasped, leaning against the damp rock wall, trying to catch his breath. Finn was with them. "They're comin' for the gully." Alara didn't hesitate. Her fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, burning anger. "We won't hide," she said, her voice steady. She handed him back his rifle and picked up a heavy piece of firewood she'd placed nearby. "They left me for dead once. They won't get a second chance." Silas looked at her, at the transformation wrought by fire and ice and betrayal. The vulnerable woman was still there, but forged now with an unbreakable will. He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. They wouldn't hide. They would stand together. They moved to the mouth of the cave, hidden by brush and shadow, waiting. They heard the crunch of boots on snow approaching the gully, then voices, rough and impatient. They waited until the first figure appeared, outlined against the snow, Finn. Before Silas could raise his rifle, Alara stepped forward, holding the heavy piece of wood like a club. "Get out!" she yelled, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the gully. "You want me? Come and get me." Her sudden appearance and defiance clearly startled the men. Finn stopped dead, his face a mask of disbelief changing quickly to rage. "The hell?" he snarled. His companion started to raise his rifle. Silas, taking his cue from Alara's boldness, fired, a clean shot that sent the second man staggering back with a cry. Finn roared and lunged forward. Alara didn't retreat. As Finn scrambled up the last bank towards the cave entrance, she swung the piece of wood with surprising force, catching him hard across the side of the head. He stumbled, dropping his rifle, clutching his head with an oath. Old John, sensing the shift, bounded forward with a fierce bark, snapping at Finn's heels, driving him back down the gully towards his injured companion and their horses. They didn't press the attack. Silas's shot, Alara's unexpected resistance, and old John's snarling aggression had broken their momentum, likely injured one, and certainly surprised them. They were opportunists, not warriors, and the cost of taking on Silas and the now feral woman they had abandoned suddenly seemed too high. Silas watched from the cave entrance as they retreated, helping the injured man onto his horse, disappearing back the way they came. He knew they wouldn't be back. Not here. Not now. The harsh land had claimed its pound of flesh from their plans. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not the silence of isolation, but of respite, of victory hard won. Alara stood beside him, breathing heavily, the piece of wood still clutched in her hand. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes blazing not with fear, but with a quiet triumph. She had faced the men who had tried to destroy her and had not only survived but fought back. Silas looked at her, his gaze holding a newfound respect. He had saved a dying woman, and in doing so, he had found something else entirely, a partner in resilience, a quiet strength that mirrored his own. The harsh environment hadn't broken her. It had tempered her, revealing the steel beneath the delicate surface. The quiet solitude of his life was over. What he had learned about her, about the cruelty she had faced and the strength she possessed, had not only changed his perception of her, but of his own life, opening it to the possibility of shared existence, of a bond forged in the crucible of the wilderness. They walked back to the cabin together, old John trotting between them. The air was still cold, but the wind had lessened. The cabin felt warmer, no longer just a shelter against the elements, but a home they had defended together. The mail-order bride abandoned to die had found not a groom, but a life, a strength, and a quiet, unspoken partnership built on shared hardship and mutual respect. Her journey had been one of despair, but it had led her not to the end, but to a beginning, here in the vast, indifferent, yet ultimately survivable land, standing tall beside the man who had saved her and learned the true meaning of resilience from the fire in her eyes.